BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Mondays I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. The first thing that I have for you is a response to a video that came out a couple months ago, actually. I just found this one, but I saw that it had been uploaded 3 months ago, and it is under the title of Zodiac Killer Mystery Solved in 2024, True Crime Documentary. It's an hour and 6 minutes long, and I decided to give it a watch. And immediately, if you do choose to watch this video, you'll find that it's not a documentary at all. It's a podcast, so the whole clickbait title really makes it drop down a couple points. But I decided to put in 25 minutes into this, and I was a little bit bored, a little bit frustrated. I didn't see where the discussions were going. It's possible that it was AI written, AI narrated, and AI generated all around. However, they started asking some questions that were actually really interesting, and I would like to try to respond to them. The first one is that, was the Zodiac Killer a drifter or a transient? And the question is asked because they're looking at the activities of the Zodiac Killer, as well as the timeline, and the infrequencies in Zodiac activity. The first Zodiac crime was on December 20th of 1968 with the Lake Herman Road murders, which saw the deaths of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Then there was the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, and that saw the death of Darlene Ferrin, and the surviving victim was Mike Mageau. Then on September 27th of 1969, there was the Lake Berryessa stabbing, which saw the death of Cecilia Shepard, and the surviving victim was Brian Hartnell. And then there was the murder of Paul Stine, the taxi driver, on October 11th of 1969, the final confirmed Zodiac crime. So this is one where they're asking this question for a very specific reason. Do these infrequencies in the Zodiac Killer's activities, or the inconsistencies, or just the absolute bizarre nature of the Zodiac Killer's timeline suggest that he was a drifter or a transient? And I'm going to have to say no, because if anything, I think that this timeline suggests that the Zodiac Killer was a resident of Northern California. And I say this because we have this 7-month gap from the Lake Herman Road murders, December 20th of 1968, to the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969. And based on how there's this very large gap, and then the gaps get smaller and smaller, going from 7 months to approximately 2 months or 7 weeks, then from 7 weeks to 2 weeks with the murder of Paul Stine. The gaps get smaller and smaller, and the frequency of letters becomes much faster. And one of the reasons why they were saying this in this True Crime Stories video is because they were talking about how, is it possible that the Zodiac Killer started operating much earlier than 1968? And they proposed that the Domingos Edwards murders that were committed in 1963, the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, could have also been the Zodiac Killer. And those took place in Southern California. So you have Southern California homicides, and then you have Northern California homicides. Does this not suggest that this was a drifter? Again, I have to say no, because as of now, I will state that there is insufficient evidence that the Zodiac Killer committed any of those Southern California crimes, whether it's the murder of Ray Davis in 62, Domingos Edwards in 63, the Swindle murders in 64, Sherry Jo Bates in 66, all the way up until 1968. And that's the first strike. And the second one is, I think that there's a much more plausible narrative that can be put forward that I was even just watching on Jimmy Akin's channel last week, where I did a direct response to his video, and he just proposed that he thinks that those were the Zodiac Killer, but he was living in Southern California from, let's say, 1962, 63, 64, 66. For the first half of the decade, he was living in Southern California. Then he moved to Northern California at some time between 1966 and 1968. Again, I do not think that that suggests that the Zodiac Killer was a drifter or a transient or somebody that was moving around. If he were a drifter or a transient, I would suggest that the Zodiac would have committed crimes in a way that was even less infrequent. Maybe one murder in California, Northern California, maybe one murder in Southern California, moving to Nevada, moving to Arizona. And if any of that happened, I think that there is insufficient evidence for that. But I would love to know your responses to that. Do you think that the Zodiac Killer was a drifter or a transient? And one more time, this documentary is available on the channel True Crime Stories. Zodiac Killer Mystery Solved in 2024. True crime documentary. But as I said, it's not a documentary, it's a podcast. However, as I was continuing with their discussions, they brought up some really interesting points about psychology. And yes, of course, it's very easy to say that the Zodiac Killer was a narcissist, but they talked about some of the reasons for the Zodiac Killer's narcissism, because in between the murders, the murder of Darlene Ferrin and the murder of Cecilia Shepard, the Zodiac Killer mailed the 408 cipher and the debut letter. And the 408 cipher's solve message said something to the effect of, "I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's even more fun than hunting wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all." And that message is something that continues with a statement that the Zodiac makes when he says, "When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and those whom I have killed will be my slaves." This is what they're focusing on. You have someone who is hunting people for sport and saying that he wants slaves in the afterlife. I talk to you guys about this all the time. And they were proposing something that is again asked in the form of a question to the audience. Is it possible that the Zodiac Killer was doing this because of his own narcissistic tendencies? And my response is, yes, of course. I don't think he believed in slaves in the afterlife. But there was a follow-up question that I really haven't thought about too much, and that is, did the Zodiac Killer have a fantasy-prone life, a fantasy-driven life, and was this something that he thought about? Was this something that he created in his own imagination? Was it something that he simply just thought was something where he could get lost in a daydream about how he's actually murdering people and he's using them as slaves? Not anything where it's a delusion where he can actually do this in the external world, but was it some type of twisted fantasy that he actually experienced? I think that that's really fascinating. And at this point, I'm unable to give you a perfect answer to that question, but I think that that is actually something that's highly, highly possible. So I give credit to True Crime Stories for putting that out there. But as I said, this was most likely an AI-written script, an AI-written podcast. Most likely they had just had AI-created images. To those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see this. Some people, of course, are listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts under the name Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. But they had one of the most bizarre images of Arthur Lee Allen that I've ever seen. And firstly, they listed Arthur Lee Allen's age as where Zodiac watched, but that was on top of the number 35. You can see how that was directly superimposed. And he was accused of committing crimes, and the crimes that he was accused of was called child molestation with a Y at the end. And I am really not trying to make light of that terrible, terrible act at all, but that's what was written out on the screen. I'm like, looks like your AI backfired a little bit. But no matter what, there were some interesting questions that had been proposed, and maybe they were copying and pasting from some other different sites, but those are the things that stood out to me once again from the channel True Crime Stories. Now, moving on to the next segment, I have to give a shout out to Jerome from the French Wrecking Crew, who was also asking me about what I thought about a possible solution to the Zodiac Killer Z13 cipher. And did I say the French Wrecking Crew? That was the old name of the channel. He now goes by Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. And last week on the channel, I was talking to you guys about Dr. Gorlick's solution to the Z13 cipher. David Ornchak, who runs the show Let's Crack the Zodiac, released a possible solution that he thinks very highly of from an individual named Dr. Ryan Gorlick. And it was that the Zodiac's solution to the cipher that has 13 characters is Dr. Eat a Torpedo. And the E needs to be changed to an R, Dr. Eat a Torpedo. And this is one that I do have a couple of follow-ups to before I get to Jerome's proposed solution. And I've also wanted to make the episodes for Black Box Online Radio more dynamic, where I'm incorporating parts of your comments and user-generated ideas for Zodiac Monday and the other shows here on Black Box Online Radio. So I'm going to read the first one from Sir Gerbil Macintosh that says, I like the simplicity of Dr. Garlick's solution. The mistake does bother me. If someone were to choose random symbols for a 13-symbol long section of the 408 or 340 ciphers, I wonder what the odds are that there would be a single mistake with that portion. My guess is just tossing out a number, maybe like 10% or less. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I do think that it's a very reasonable attempt. I think it's a valiant effort to take the Zodiac Killer's symbols from the 340 cipher that was solved, the way that Dr. Garlick did, and he altered two things because the Zodiac introduced some new characters, and he recognizes that it doesn't perfectly work out to English language words, so what he has to do is he has to correct them. You almost have to self-modify them. You have to know where the mistakes are, and you have to correct them yourselves. As a prime example, Dr. Ida Torpedo. Okay, well, torpedo might not be a word that many people are thinking of. Clearly, it's the word torpedo. And this was meant to be an insult, something that was very suggestive. And if your suspect is Arthur Lee Allen owned torpedo explosives. Okay, that was the focus of last week's episode. But the more I think about this solution, the less that I like it. And one of the reasons for that is, it's actually something that came to us from Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, when he was talking about how the Zodiac introduced the new symbol with the circled 8, as well as the Aries symbol might even be something that is somewhat unique to the Z13 cipher, and I just began to think more about how it would be so much easier to just create a simple substitution cipher, and by introducing one or two new characters, it completely throws off the previous ciphers. You have to disregard the previous ciphers. This is a simple substitution cipher, but now you're back to the drawing board. You can't just use a previous method. And I think that would be much more challenging, as well as you'd have to solve the ciphers independently as opposed to these types of interlocking mechanisms. But I could be completely wrong about that. And now I would like to get to Jerome's solution. Again, Jerome, the host of the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. This may be one that he found because he posted a TikTok on his YouTube Shorts page that had this possible solution to the Zodiac Killer Z13 cipher, and it's the word metamorphosis. The word metamorphosis has 13 letters in it. 13 letters, 13 symbols. Yes, but Metamorphosis is also the title of a book by Edward Wayne Edwards, one of the suspects in the Zodiac Killer mystery. And Ed Edwards is a suspect that comes up very frequently in these discussions. I've noticed that, absolutely, Edward Wayne Edwards is not the most widely discussed suspect, but there are lots of connections to the ciphers. Now, I have a couple problems with this one because, going back to our same issue, we have the 3 circled 8s. And it's just bothering me that the word metamorphosis does not have 3 repeating letters, even if it's something that has to be unscrambled, even if it's something that has to be rearranged. I can accept all that. There are lots of double letters, because if we look at the Z13 cipher, it goes A, E, N, Zodiac symbol, 8K, 8M, 8 Aries, NAM. Now, we don't even know if that is an Aries, but that's what I'll call it. And I'm not seeing 3 repeating symbols. So that has the exact same problem as Dr. Garlick's solution, where he is changing one of the circled 8s to the appropriate character to fit into his solution, which makes me wonder, is this actually going to work out? The double letters in Metamorphosis, sure, okay, there are 2 I's in Metamorphosis, there are 2 M's in Metamorphosis, and the Z13 has double letters, but I looked this over again. Maybe I'm blind as a bat, but I did not see a triple letter. So I have some doubts that that is the exact solution to the Z13 cipher, but I appreciate the request from Jerome all the same. And I would like to get to our next comment that's going to be worked into this episode, and this one is going to come to us from C.G. Karras, and he says, same thoughts here regarding Dr. Garlick's solution. As for Brian Koberger, he is being railroaded. It was the frat boys. The DNA evidence is crap. Brian Koberger is, of course, the subject of a very famous high-profile trial that is going on now in response to the Idaho quadruple homicide. If you are following anything true crime related, perhaps you have seen something related to Brian Koberger in the news. And last week on the channel, I was doing a comparison between Brian Koberger and the Zodiac Killer, which mostly came from a channel called Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. But one follow-up that I have about that is, when we look at some of the previous pre-Zodiac attacks, particularly the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, I actually see some similarities between the murderer of Sherry Jo Bates and Brian Koberger as compared to the Zodiac Killer. Now, maybe C.G. Karras is completely right. He was innocent. I will always hear alternative theories. But I'm going to explore the conventional narrative in this one. And just hear me out on this. With the Koberger case, they believe that even though 4 people were murdered, maybe only one of them was the specific target. And maybe he was following that person for a while, maybe he was looking into that person's background and behaviors, maybe he expected that that person would have been home, and that was most likely the victim Maddie Mogan, although it could be Kaylee Gonsalves, one of the other roommates in the house, and he murdered one person, then because of convenience he had to murder a second, and then because of an obstacle he had to murder the third and fourth victims because they were blocking his exit, as well as just causing some trouble for him, and those were not planned, but he committed those murders all the same. And the similarities between the Idaho quadruple homicide and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates from 1966, a possible Zodiac crime, are that, number 1, both crimes were committed by knife. Number 2, I believe this, even though I can't present this in a court of law, I believe that Sherry Jo Bates was not killed by the Zodiac Killer. I believe that Sherry Jo was targeted by somebody who developed a type of obsession with her, who began watching her movements, who began monitoring her activities, who knew where she was going and what she was doing, and then, when she walked out to her car one night, October 30th, 1966, in the dark, and she was in a vulnerable place, this person seized their opportunity and lured Sherry Jo Bates to an alleyway where she was stabbed to death. And I think something very similar happened with the Idaho murders, although somebody did write out their theory just in the comments section on YouTube. What a wonderful place to get your news. And that person stated that they thought that there were actually 2 specific targets, both Maddie Mogan and Kaylee Gonsalves, and that someone had been following them on social media, and that they were actually looking at a live stream that had been done in Idaho, and they could see this is what is referred to as the grub truck live stream, and they could see there that they were both heavily intoxicated, because if there is just one specific target, why would you have to break into their house? You could attack the person, much like the killer of Sherry Jo Bates did, by waiting for her to walk out to her car by herself, waiting for her to be alone outside, as opposed to creating more trouble for yourself inside the house, which was ultimately the reason why Brian Koberger was arrested. But if there were 2 specific targets, knowing where they would be, and knowing that they would not have the capabilities to fight back, then that could trigger somebody to break into the home. But that's all theoretical. There's lots of conjecture and speculation. I would like to go back to the murder of Sherry Jo Bates and explain why I think this. It's October 30th of 1966. Sherry Jo has been stabbed to death, and I think that somebody had really been focused on her for a very long time. And a piece of evidence that I would state is that I do indeed believe that the Riverside Confession that was written roughly a month after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, where it talks about how she was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead, Miss Bates went to the slaughter like a lamb, I think that that was written by the real killer, and this person is laying everything out. He wanted to make her pay for the brush-offs that she had given him, meaning that he likes her, he's sexually attracted to her, but she is ignoring him. And I think that there was some type of, maybe overly used exaggeration by the person who wrote this, hyperbole, if you will, because this is a very clear case of how someone might have developed this type of delusion in their own mind about how she is brushing him off. Maybe the killer didn't even know Sherry Joe personally. Maybe he's just looking at her and she's not paying attention to him. People create these types of scenarios in their own minds, and I do think that that is somewhat of a reasonable and defendable possibility. However, maybe they did know each other, maybe they were on a first name basis. An alternative scenario is highly possible. I do not think that the murderer of Sherry Joe Bates wrote the desktop poem from December of '66 or the Bates Had to Die letters from the spring of 1967, but I do think that the real killer wrote the Riverside Confession, and I don't think that any of this was the Zodiac. And if you want to challenge me on that, once again, please put your idea in the comments section down below. And I do have a couple of announcements that I would like to talk to you guys about. The first is, I hope you'll stick around to the end of this episode because you can hear the interview that I did with Sonnet Daymont, and this is one that will be aired today as well as another segment on Thursday. Sonnet Daymont is a psychotherapist, and she was introduced to me by a third party, and they were talking about having her as a guest on Black Box Online Radio, and I thought, okay, well, on the Thursday shows, I often talk about the dark triad traits, psychology, psychopathy even, and just looking at the activities of psychopaths, psychopathic serial killers, all of that stuff. I thought it would be an interesting interview. But then I learned, in addition to being a psychotherapist, Sonnet Daymont was also someone who grew up in the Bay Area, so she was relatively familiar with the story of the Zodiac Killer, not from a deep dive research standpoint, but someone who grew up hearing about it, as well as forming her own opinion and ideas about the Zodiac. So please stick around to the end. And also, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to last week's interview on Zodiac Monday with Kristen DeToni, author of the book Cryptology Collections. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. Anybody can support these efforts with buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And I told you guys last week that if you made a donation on buymeacoffee.com, I would send it to the Paralyzed Veterans for America. That was an idea that was proposed by Ray Penrod, and I thank him for that suggestion. And the first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that. Batman66, thank you for your regular and consistent support, as well as for supporting the Paralyzed Veterans of America. And Batman66 says, to the Paralyzed Veterans of America and BBO War Ned. Much appreciated. And Batman66 has also been helping out a lot with the shorts that come out Monday through Friday here on Black Box Online Radio. I release shorts here on YouTube, as well as reels on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, and they mostly talk about serial killers, but any subject is fair game. And the next one comes to us from Classic Chevy Cat, who says, what a great idea, donating to the Paralyzed Veterans. I'm in. God bless you, Ned. Classic Chevy Cat. Thank you for that as well, and thank you for supporting the Paralyzed Veterans of America. And our next shout-out goes to River Prawn Pottery. River Prawn Pottery, thank you as well for your support, and your regular and consistent support at that. Much appreciated. And if we're going to talk about regular and consistent supporters, we also have one coming to us from CZ Guy. CZ Guy has also become a regular and consistent supporter, and I would just like to say thank you to everyone for making these donations, once again, going to the Paralyzed Veterans of America. And I would like to continue with some of the announcements. And the first is that I would like to give a big thanks to everyone who's been following along with the JonBenet Ramsey episodes that I've done on this channel. I added a Tuesday segment about JonBenet Ramsey where I was doing a multi-part series, and that segment wasn't intended to be permanent. Instead, I wanted to go through some of the books, as well as some of the articles and documentaries, as well as presentations from the mainstream outlets like Court TV, and, of course, looking at alternative suspects in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, and I'll be doing a special live stream about that tomorrow, here on Black Box Online Radio. And then, as I said, on Thursday, I'll play a segment of my interview with Sonnet Daymont. You'll hear the first segment tonight, and then at the start of next week, there will be a return of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. The regular live streams will be coming back Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I invite you guys to check those out, mostly focusing on criminal psychology, forensics, and criminology, so that anybody who watches those can ask any question that they want, or they can discuss any subject they want. If they want to talk about the Zodiac Killer, you can talk about the Zodiac. If you want to talk about Jack the Ripper or D.B. Cooper, you can do that as well. Or if there are just other cases that you want discussed on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, all of it is fair game. So please feel free to check that out. And one more time, you can subscribe to this channel if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions. And the next thing that I have for you here on Black Box Online Radio is a little bit different. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer that created his letters and ciphers and cryptograms and greeting cards as taunts, where he's bragging and taking credit for the crimes. And to the credit of True Crime Stories, they did talk about how this is all fueled by his own narcissistic endeavors and narcissistic intents. But some people begin to wonder if the Zodiac Killer was making taunts about crimes that he did not commit. Was he taking credit for crimes that he did not commit? Was he allowing other people to think that he was responsible for murders that he had nothing to do with? Well, one person who would believe that is Thomas Henry Horn, who's the author of the book The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. And this is a book that I've discussed a lot in the past on Black Box Online Radio, and it was also turned into a documentary in 2023. He's a supporter of the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, where someone would be taking credit for crimes that he did not commit. And I want to talk to you guys about a real serial killer hoax that someone launched, and let's look at some comparisons between the Zodiac Killer and the Catch Me Killer. And to help us out, we're going to look at an article from 2010 written by Lee Farron of ABC News, just citing the source. And the Catch Me Killer was somebody who created an elaborate series of taunts, and he was taking credit for crimes that he did not commit. And this was not done, though, via letters, not the way the Zodiac did. This was done on YouTube. Let's look here. May 20th, 2010. A man faces the camera with his digitally blotted out face and his eerily altered voice. The voice was altered to sound deep and throaty, like a grumble, but nothing can hide the horror of his words. He calmly boasts of slaughtering 16 young women and hiding their bodies. The video poster is calling himself the Catch Me Killer, and he offers clues about murder cases and challenges searchers to find the women before he reveals them. Only after investigators and the families of two very real victims raced to catch the killer did they discover that it was all a hoax. It was a game, put on by someone who was seeking attention. Andrew Haley, 27 years old at the time, of Gainesville, Georgia, was allegedly making false statements and tampering with evidence after officials with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified him as the creator of the videos. There was nothing to indicate that he was involved in any of the murders. And this is something, though, that I really could not find too much about, and I think it's something that YouTube really just wants to get rid of. When I tried looking for videos on the Catch Me Killer here on YouTube, they are few and far between. And I first found out about this, I think, because of a segment that was done on a Nick Crowley video, but there really aren't too many specific YouTube videos that are devoted to this case. But I've had the opportunity to interview Mark Hewitt 3 times. Mark Hewitt is the author of Hunted, Profiled, and Exposed, 3 books about the Zodiac Killer, and he also added a 4th, which is a memoir called Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer. And because I had just read The Myth of the Zodiac, I was talking to him about that. I'm saying, okay, there's this Zodiac Killer hoax theory out there. Well, why is it wrong? And the response from Mark Hewitt was, why would somebody take credit for murders that they did not commit? If they actually did solve the crimes, then this hoaxer would look like a complete fraud. Everybody would actually know that he wasn't responsible for this, and there would be no reason to take him seriously. So when we look at that in contrast to somebody like this Catch Me Killer who's posting online, this person is taking credit for murders that they did not commit, saying, I murdered 16 people, and if I'll give you the clues and then you can catch me. I mean, it sounds very similar to the Zodiac, does it not? So this is proof that people actually do things like this. This is someone who is taking credit for crimes that he had nothing to do with. He's putting on these ruses. Like, another comparison would be, think about the Zodiac Killer with his body count total of 37. Think about the Zodiac Killer always raising the score of that body count. Think of the Zodiac Killer saying that he's going to commit crimes and make them look like routine robberies and accidents. The Zodiac is using this to taunt people. But, you know, and it goes to show that people can create these types of hoaxes. But a big difference between the Zodiac Killer and the Catch Me Killer is that the Zodiac was not using the internet. He was not using things like URLs, which is ultimately how they caught the Catch Me Killer. But believe it or not, though, I do side with Mark Hewitt on this. Even though I just offer some counter explanation, I do think that the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s that we know, that we've looked at for so many years, would not do that. For the following reason: the Zodiac was so narcissistic that he would have been aware that if he is going to provide all of these details for crimes that he didn't commit, then it's going to look really bad for him if he's busted. And if he's just putting this on as some type of elaborate series of pranks and ruses and a bunch of silly little games, that's exactly what it would look like. Everyone would think, oh, this Zodiac Killer, he's not a terrifying individual. He is someone who's playing pranks and putting on ruses and creating a silly set of games. And I don't think the Zodiac would have risked that. And one thing that they concluded with on the True Crime Stories channel that I was talking about at the beginning of this episode is that the Zodiac Killer entered into a world where people want to know the truth. He entered into a world where people just have this desire to know, and they want the answers. And if it turns out that it's all fake, well, then there's your answer. The Zodiac would have been a total fraud and no one would have cared. Instead, the Zodiac, by committing real crimes and taking credit for them, he turned himself into a giant symbol of terror, where some people actually took his threats seriously, where some people actually thought that he wanted slaves in the afterlife, and they viewed him as something to be afraid of, as opposed to just a silly prankster. So that's why I agree with the statement that the Zodiac of the 1960s would not have done that. But what do you think about any of this? And let's be clear, there are other hoaxers out there. The Chinese Zodiac Killer that was talked about in 2022 was most likely a hoaxer, and I have an episode about him here on Black Box Online Radio. And right now, I would like to get to the interview segment that I did with Sonnet Daymont. And once again, we're going to be talking about several different subjects, and before we get to the Zodiac Killer, and for about the first 9 minutes, we're going to be talking about psychology. And if you want to jump straight to the Zodiac parts, there is a quick reference that is posted down below in the comments section. And we'll discuss the Zodiac Killer for a little bit, and then we will come back to a different segment on the Thursday show. And please tune in next week for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, Tuesdays and Thursdays here on BBO War, in addition to the Ripper Wednesday show and the Cooper Friday show. And in just a second, I'll welcome Sonnet Daymont to the program. She is the author of the upcoming book, When Dangerous Feels Like Home. She is a psychotherapist, and she has a lot of observations about human behavior and the Zodiac Killer. Let's welcome Sonnet Daymont.
I was going to just say that, like, sort of the main crossover with antisocial personality disorder, which is what people think of with psychopaths, is that they're more likely to commit a crime or break a rule. A narcissist really wants attention. And I tend to think of it as narcissism, the main drive is attention. With antisocial or psychopaths, the main drive is sort of excitement or thrill. And then with sociopaths, which also are Machiavellian, the main drive is like power and control.
Now, Sonnet, I read a lot about psychology. I watch lots of YouTube videos about psychology. Sometimes I'll even read academic journals. But I'm still a layperson. So, would you mind if I share with you my understandings of the Dark Triad, and you as a professional can tell me where I'm wrong, where I'm right, what I need to improve upon? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, bearing in mind that all of these are sort of social constructs, and just as the ICD-11 is a little different than the DSM, my interpretation as a person who works with crime survivors is probably different than someone who worked in a prison or with the FBI.
Okay, though, so with my understanding of psychopathy is that to be a clinical psychopath, someone has to be evaluated by an examiner using the HARE checklist, which is a 20-item checklist that has a score of 0, 1, or 2 for each item. The maximum score is 40, and if someone scores 30 out of higher on the HARE checklist, they are deemed a clinical psychopath. However, that is only for the United States and maybe other countries. In the United Kingdom, if I recall, it's 25 out of 40, and they would be deemed a clinical psychopath. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, anyone who's gone online, you can just search for the hair psychopathy checklist. It's a quick little quiz. In fact, I just looked it up right now on Psychology Tools, and even just looking at it, you'll see these different diagnostic criteria and how they fit into the disorder.
All right, though, but then we get to something such as narcissism, and this is how it was presented to me. When we're children, we perhaps hear the story of Narcissus, which is about discussing vanity. But once I became an adult and people were discussing narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, this is the first way that I learned about it. And someone told me a narcissist is someone who thinks they can do no wrong. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I would disagree. I think some narcissists might not really mind if they do wrong. They want attention, whether it's good or bad, depending on their interest. And it's more about that external validation that fuels them than thinking they're better. I guess it depends on how you define better.
But yes, we can always use your personal definitions. I'm very curious what you think. And that will bring us to Machiavellianism. And I first
Mm-hmm.
talked about this on Black Box Online Radio about 5 years ago. And the definition that I first learned was that a Machiavellian is someone who believes that they are either superior or more intelligent than those who run society. And they don't have to follow the rules of society. They can move around them. They can kind of just weave in and out of whatever type of rule based construct they are in, and in short, they can do things in their own way. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree with that. I think that term, the way I interpret the term Machiavellianism, kind of goes back to Machiavelli, right? And to this idea of how do you be strategic to get what you want, whether or not you consider anyone else's need or sort of the greater good, or do you change the definition of those things without making space for other people to contribute?
And one thing I'd really like to know is how do these traits manifest in everyday life, like beyond extreme cases seen in the media? Like, how would these things be more more prevalent in a society, and what are you going to experience in your day to day life?
I have people come in who want to work on issues of intense interactions with dark triads, like high profile crime survivors. But then I also have people come in where they're just unsure if their boss is trustworthy. And a lot of times people with dark triad traits are smart enough to stay under the radar and just sort of use it to have a slow life where they meet their needs and get the things they want out of other people. There is a great book. Um, there's so many great books on this, but if this is something that you're worried you're dealing with or something that you think about, The Sociopath Next Door is sort of like the classic read on people who have dark triad traits that just are in our everyday lives, in our families, in our companies, in politics, and how to navigate them. There's another book that I really loved called Psychopath Free by Jackson McKenzie, who passed away not too long ago, where he, I guess similar to yourself, I would think, Ned, he had an online following, and this was in maybe like the late 90s, early 2000s, and he just collected thousands and thousands of stories on a message board of people feeling like they interacted with dark triads. And he put them all together and organized them and looked at traits that they had in common. And they were just people in everyday life that were absolutely meeting the hair's diagnostic criteria.
Now, there's a very famous statement out there that all psychopaths are narcissistic, but not all narcissists are psychopaths. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I disagree. I think that drive for attention that is sort of the crux of narcissism, where it's like they're so vulnerable to that drive for external validation or external acknowledgement. Doesn't necessarily come with this drive for a thrill that you see in psychopaths. I think there's some psychopaths that really don't care about the external attention. They want something else. Maybe they want more of an interpersonal acknowledgement or a different set of goals that doesn't involve the external.
I think this is going to be one of the few times on Black Box Online Radio where I'm going to say that I actually agree with somebody 100%, maybe even 101%, and everything that you just said about that statement is more or less what I think. And I was influenced by the YouTube psychologist Professor Sam Vodkin, who coined the term narcissistic abuse. And he said that there's this statement that gets shared on the internet all the time that all psychopaths are narcissistic, but not all narcissists are psychopaths. And he took a bold stance by saying if somebody says that, they don't know what they're talking about, because a primary difference is the narcissist requires external validation and the psychopath does not. Someone can be psychopathic without this desire for external validation. And I think that you said all of that in your own words. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I agree with that statement. I mean, even if you want to get into the Zodiac Killer, we can talk about all the different theories that run around there about
I
who
would
people
love
think it
to.
was and what was going on with those letters, right? Like that was an absolute reach for external validation and attention.
So, every Monday I do an episode about the Zodiac Killer for Black Box Online Radio, which people can listen to. It's just called Zodiac Monday. And, Sonnet, would you like to provide just your own introduction to the Zodiac Killer, your initial observations, everything you think about the story?
Well, I'm not an expert in serial killers. Like that isn't my go-to. But I did live in San Francisco for most of my life, so I'm familiar with that one. And he was a Bay Area based killer that was active in the late 60s. And he used cryptography to sort of, I guess, like torture or grab attention or engage with the media and the police.
Absolutely, that's fair. The way that I like to introduce the Zodiac Killer is I say that the Zodiac Killer was not only a serial killer, he also wrote letters, the cryptogram ciphers, he also made diagrams, and even greeting cards, all just taunting the general public. And it's interesting that you use the word torture because there is something torturous to it. People often use the word domestic terrorist, or two words actually, but that's one way that they call the Zodiac Killer, because they say he wasn't only a serial killer by making threats to detonate bombs, those were the diagrams I talked about, making threats to go after school children, going after school buses, going on kill rampages. That isn't just being a serial killer. That's spreading the image of terror. So I would agree that there's a certain torturous aspect to it. But what are some other observations you've made about the Zodiac Killer mystery?
Well, I think you're right. I think there was like sort of a sadistic, torturous part with those letters. I think they're really interesting when you look at them, as painful as it is for the family members and people who were living in those areas at that time and scared. But years later, looking back at that, the greeting cards, the cryptography, all of it is really intense. Like he obviously was trying to send some kind of message and wanted it to be seen. My thought is, and this is, I'm just like a lay person here who happens to work with crime survivors, but and I grew up in that area. Is he looks a lot like Robert Hansen, and their years really overlap, and there's some similarities and differences between them that I think are interesting to look at. And it's hard for me to believe no one's gone through and tried to like do DNA confirmation to see if any of the evidence looked similar or if there just wasn't any. But their years, their geographies, they both were, in the Bay Area a lot. I think Robert Hansen even grew up near the Bay Area before
Well,
Alaska. So it's just that's something to me where I'm like, well, these personalities are similar in some ways, but different, and they look, I mean, they look absolutely alike, and the years overlap and the geography overlaps.
oh, yes, and for the audience, Robert Christian Hansen was a serial killer called the Butcher Baker, and he committed his crimes in Alaska. And it's one of the few examples of someone who was actually hunting people for sport in a more literal sense than the Zodiac Killer, because Robert Christian Hansen would abduct sex workers, and he would lure them into his car, and then he would slap a pair of handcuffs on the woman, and one part would be connected to a console in the car, and then he would just slap the other cuff on her wrist. And it got to the point where he said that he was so good at it that he could do it like a reflex. And then he would take them to a plane, fly them out to in a secluded area, the wilderness, and actually hunt them down for sport with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. Now you mentioned Robert Christian Hansen growing up in the Bay Area. Originally he was from Pocahontas, Iowa, and then he does go out west, and he moves to Alaska in 1967. And that is one of the biggest problems I have with him as a suspect, is that the Zodiac Killer commits the first crime in 1968, and it is possible to fly from Anchorage to San Francisco. But I completely admit that Robert Christian Hansen was even a pilot, as I said. And it's interesting that you bring him up because Dr. Lee Meller, who hosted the Citizen Detective podcast, really thought highly of Robert Christian Hansen as a Zodiac Killer suspect. He was one that he was speaking about him just very adamantly on his show, the Citizen Detective podcast. And would you say he's your top suspect?
I think he's, yeah, I mean, I suppose I don't know all of the suspects. I haven't followed it closely, but I do know that he lived in the Richmond, California area, which is near where some of the crimes happened with the Zodiac Killer. And it, the psychology of it's interesting to me because of the hunting theme. Now, obviously, all serial killers are hunting others, right? But there is like a real sort of expert hunting situation going on with Robert Hansen that was, I could see the Zodiac Killer sort of progressing and moving his hunting somewhere like Alaska. I also think that there's, it's hard to mail out of Alaska during those years. And sure, you could get on a plane and fly between SFO and Alaska pretty easily. But to actually engage with the post and all of that and not have people see that things are coming from Alaska would be sort of an explanation for why the letters dropped off too. Maybe he progressed and he got more interested in different things. My understanding is he was married.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah, and was he married about 7 years, like a 7-year itch?
It's been quite a while since I've looked into him. That detail has escaped me, but I believe he was married with children, if I recall correctly.
Okay. Interesting.
And does the 7-year itch come up a lot with serial killers or psychopaths?
I think it comes up with infidelity in general. I think there is sort of like these waves, this cultural joke about the 7-year itch where people have a hard time being faithful. I think that something does sort of happen with the way the neuroscience of love plays out when people are partnered long term. When you first start dating someone and it's really exciting and it's new, and then you keep dating them and the love sort of shifts and becomes more of a calming presence and more of a oxytocin fulfilling type of love. Love shifts in time, and at that 7-year mark, when you're with the same partner, it feels very different than when you first start dating a new person. And so there is a lot of I don't know, like social, I almost want to say like a wives' tale, but like out in the world, we all talk about the 7-year itch, and I think there's a little bit of science to it in terms of the way our brains relate to long-term partnerships. And when I was reading about those two killers, what I noticed was there could have been like a 7-year mark with his marriage where the raping started if he were the Zodiac Killer as well. But I don't know.
But do you hear that, everyone? Nobody is safe from this. It's not only the psychopaths, it's not only the serial killers, it will happen to you too.
It's your coworker. No, but sometimes people have a really, hard time sharing space with each other and figuring out what to do with themselves here.
But one point where I will revisit is I do agree with the statement you made about how Robert Christian Hansen and the Zodiac Killer are both very hunter themed serial killers. And yes, you said every serial killer has some type of hunting humans for sport aspect. But with the Zodiac Killer, what he did was he specifically chose to emphasize this. He chose to say this in his own words in the 408 cipher that was mailed in July of 1969, when he says that to kill is the most thrilling experience. It's even more fun than hunting. It's even more thrilling than getting your rocks off with a girl, and it's better than hunting wild game in the forest. So he is saying those direct words that killing people is more fun than hunting wild game. And then Robert Christian Hansen literally hunted people for sport as well in the manner that I described. So when I did my first episodes on him as a Zodiac Killer suspect, I was like, all right, I'm not going to deny this similarity. Now, there are a couple other things, though, about Robert Christian Hansen that I would really like to ask you about. If you were
Sure.
to watch a serial killer documentary about him, you might see some things to the effect of he grew up with a stutter, he had severe acne, he was very self-conscious about it, he was very hesitant to talk to people, he struggled a lot with dating and social interactions. He felt somewhat rejected by his peers. And how much of an influence are things like that on someone becoming a serial killer?
Well, I think it's going to depend on the person, right? I mean, there's some serial killers that are very handsome, but perhaps with Robert Hansen, it did play into it. It also sounds like he was incredibly charming at the same time, and really well liked everywhere he went.
In Alaska, sure, I agree with that. Like, that's one of the reasons why it's reported that he was able to get away with it for so long, because he was just Bob the Baker. That's how he gets a serial killer named the Butcher Baker, because he ran a bakery. And, he's just this pleasant guy who's working in the bakery and being nice to customers. What? Bob the Baker? No, no way. He would never hurt anyone. He was let's say the nicest guy in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to ask you, though, about those types of tropes and behaviors and commonly held beliefs that people have about serial killers. What really is the driving force? Because as you just brought up, clear as day, some serial killers are unattractive and rejected by their peers, and then there are the serial killers like Ted Bundy, who are reported to have been conventionally attractive and they're very good at charming people. And what really is this driving factor that encourages somebody to kill?
Well, I mean, if we look at antisocial personality disorder, the drive there would be thrill, right? So I would wager that it really comes down to that, to this idea that they just want to experience the rush or the thrill of it. I don't know how necessary or how often, I guess is probably a better descriptor, you need to be seeking that thrill to validate not getting enough love or attention or something as a child. Some people might just be wanting a thrill for some other kind of reason. Maybe they grew up with a lot of thrills and they can't get enough. I think it just sort of comes down to a drive for a thrill. Again, I'm not necessarily an expert in looking for or treating people who have antisocial personality disorder. I work with people who've survived interactions with them. So my vantage point might be a little different.
And once again, I would like to thank Sonnet Daymont for appearing on Black Box Online Radio, and I'm very grateful that she wanted to be a guest on the program and she was willing to talk to me. So as for her suspect, Robert Christian Hansen, I've been looking at him for a while as a Zodiac suspect. He was first suggested to me back in 2019, and I made my initial set of observations. I looked at his behavior, and I thought that it was drastically different. But as of now, I am fully aware that criminals can change their ways, that different crimes can be committed for different reasons. Killers can evolve, killers can devolve, all of those things. And there are countless examples throughout the true crime world, which we can talk about in the comments section if you want. But my biggest challenge to anyone who thinks that Robert Christian Hansen was the Zodiac Killer, can we place him in the Bay Area in 1968 or 69? Can we do that? Once you can show me that Robert Christian Hansen was regularly in California in 1968 and 69, then we can talk. Because he was a real serial killer, but he was based out of Alaska from 1967 and onwards. I understand the profiling issues. I understand the hunting for sport angle, which, as I said during the interview, is the strongest point. But until someone can place him in the Bay Area in 68 and 69, I have some reservations. But what would you think? And, you can respond to any of the comments made by Sonnet Daymont. What do you think about anything that I said in regards to the True Crime Stories podcast, the solution to the Z13 cipher, the Catch Me Killer, and, of course, Robert Christian Hansen as a Zodiac Killer suspect? Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Black Box Online Radio, and that will be all for me now, and I will see you guys tomorrow for the live stream about JonBenet Ramsey. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, which I'm hoping to use more, and of course, BlackBoxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram, which I use to release the reels, and that is all. Goodbye.